But white people, they don't want white, a genetic recessive trait, to disappear. So I have spoken to audiences of white people and asked them, do you want your children to be colored? Do you want your grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-great-great-grandchildren to be colored? I'm polite and they're polite. What do they say? Because the big, huge problem of racism, this man had found the key that we're dealing with a total system. So then from that point, I started wondering, well, why would a group of people who call themselves white, why would they set up such a system on this planet? Not in Washington, D.C., on this planet. And one day I was in my apartment, washing dishes, cooking, and the brain computer came with a printout. And I started thinking, see, if you put a question in your mind, why? You are telling your brain computer, bring in data to answer the question. And little children magically understand that. Because when they're 2 and they begin to start talking and thinking, and they keep saying, why? Why? You see, and grown-ups get annoyed, but the child is trying to understand cause and effect on this planet, in this world that they have been brought into. So I had been saying, but why would they do it? Mr. Fuller would say, Francis, it's not important. Why? Just learn what they do. But I was still, as a psychiatrist, but why would they do it? So I started thinking about some of the things that people who classify themselves as white would say about black people. The first thing, they were always saying that they were genetically superior to us. How many people remember hearing that? Like all the time. So I thought about that. The other thing that I thought about was they referred to the people of color on the planet, the black, brown, red, and yellow people, all of them having pigmentation due to the black pigment melanin, that they were minorities. And so I started thinking, wait a minute, in other words, I've been in their schools a long time. Number one, they are...
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching from. As you know, I'm your host and present HTech Stories. In today's video, we are going to look at why white people behave the way they do. In the contemporary racial studies, we saw the relationship between white people and violence, especially in the United States. In majority of these states that violence was so much seen, we saw there was a problem, and the problem was the opioid crisis. Now, there is a different aspect that Dr. Cress Welsing comes up with. And Dr. Cress Welsing, in his work, Theory of Color-Confrontation, this is a framework which he used to explain the historical relationship between white America and violence. Now, Welsing argued that patterns of violence in Western societies cannot be understood merely as individual pathology or random, they cannot be understood as an individual pathology or random social breakdowns, but they can be understood as a systemic response which is embedded in long history of global domination by a minority population, right? Because she began from the premise that people classified as white constitute as numerical minority on planet, and that this demographic reality has historically produced a deep, often unconscious anxiety about survival, about power, and and continuity. So according to Dr. Cress Welsing, violence becomes a structural tool which is embedded in law, which is embedded in culture, embedded in economics and warfare, which used to manage this anxiety and to maintain dominance over non-white populations, particularly black people. So brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video and then I'll be back. I'll be sharing my thoughts. And just a simple request, if you're probably watching me for the first time, I'm asking you to please subscribe to the channel and then join the membership. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts in regards to this. So let's watch the video.
Are a tiny minority. They are fewer than 1/10 of the people on this planet. Instead of black people being genetically inferior, black people are genetically dominant to people who classify themselves as white. The ability to produce the black pigment that causes our skin to have coloration is a genetically dominant trait. If anybody doesn't understand what I'm talking about, all you have to do is think about our president, Barack Obama. His mother was white. His father was black. Black is a genetically dominant trait. White is a genetic recessive trait. A dominant plus a recessive always equals a dominant. So there's no way a white person plus a black person is going to get a white person. They had an opportunity on all the plantations to study that for hundreds of years. We've never come up with anything other than a shade of black. So once that came into my brain computer, I really said, I've got it. That's the answer. You know, I didn't tear up my kitchen, but I said, that's the answer. Because during the 15th century, everybody knows about Columbus sailed, the first person out of Europe to begin circumnavigating the planet. Well, many other so-called explorers and discoverers came after him. What they found out was that every place they landed, there were colored people. Colored people everywhere. No white people other than that tiny, tiny area across the Mediterranean, north of Africa, that is called Europe. And so then the men on those voyages, if the women were either subdued or if they were extremely hospitable, after there was sexual contact between the white men and the women of color, and they waited around 9 months to get their boats repaired, they found out that all the children ended up looking like their mothers. And so I don't know whether they built a big institution to study genetics. Basically, really, they didn't have a major science of genetics at that point. But they realized, what if these colored men of color got in their boats and started going from south to north and descended on Europe? And that's happening today.
That's right.
They understood that if this happened, if this was allowed to happen, that's why a lot of the black people who were trying to get into Europe, they let the boats drown, or let the people drown in those boats. But they realized that white would disappear. And so I said, this is the answer, and this is the key to racism. I mean, people are accustomed to saying and thinking racism means you can't use this water fountain, you can't sit on this toilet, you can't shop in this store, or you can't do this, or you can't be in that hotel, and on and on and on. But underneath all of those surface things is the awareness on the part of people who classify themselves as white, that they could be genetically annihilated and they could disappear. I maintain that Abraham Lincoln, when he emancipated us from formal enslavement, Abraham Lincoln concluded that he could not make the black people social equals of whites because he understood, even though he didn't talk about it openly, that if everybody was allowed to do, and this is Dr. Martin Luther King's home state. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about people should learn how to love and respect and only focus on character. But imagine what would have happened if all the people of color and all of the white people in this area of the world and even throughout the world, if everybody just embraced. And, you know, somebody like Rodney King said, why can't we all just get along? Now, those are wonderful ideas. But if everybody just loved and everybody just got along and nobody paid any attention to skin color, what would happen? White people would disappear. Now, some black people may not understand how important that is to white people. Because black people under white supremacy have been trained to want color to disappear. But white people, they don't want white, a genetic recessive trait, to disappear. So I have spoken to audiences of white people and asked them, do you want your children to be colored? Do you want your grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-grandchildren to be colored? Do you want your great-great-great-grandchildren to be colored? I'm polite and they're polite. What do they say? No. No. So I simply say, if you mean that, then you will have to do certain specific things in all of the areas of people activity: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, to prevent that from happening on a planet where the people are overwhelmingly black, brown, red, and yellow. And this is what the people who classify themselves as white are doing that is responsible for all of the discomfort that we experience as black people, as black women, as black men, as black children. And what is very important for us to understand, and I say that racism is war against black people in general, but black men in particular.
Hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to the channel. It is so much the pride of black Americans seeing us having scholars that address these issues. And trust me, somehow you might listen to other white professors like Tim Wise talking about this. Trust me, for the longest time, they have learned from black professors who have lived firsthand all these experiences. So when they say it, these professors take notes and they try to do their own research and see that what Dr. Cress Welsing was trying to say, what Dr. Ivan Satimo was trying to say is true. And other black professors, other black scholars that have tried to address these social patterns, these social issues that are happening. Now, I'm going to be going down to what Dr. Cress Welsing has addressed. Remember, central to Welsing's argument is the idea of white identity. And he says that he sees white identity as a constructed something which is constructed in modern history, which is not merely a neutral racial category, but she sees it as a power station that emerged through conquest. It also emerged through enslavement and colonization. So she maintained that European expansion required extreme violence to dispossess indigenous people and to enslave Africans, and that these acts were later rationalized through ideology, religion, pseudoscience, and legal doctrine, right? So in a way, violence was not incidental to white America's rise, but it was so foundational to it. It was the name of everything that made them successful, right? Now, from genocide against Native Americans to the chattel slavery and racial terror, Dr. Cress Welsing, she saw a consistent pattern, and the consistent pattern was violence, which they used it for their own means. And you understand that violence functioned as a means of establishing, as a means of enforcing and normalizing white dominance, while simultaneously shaping the psychology to see such violence as justified, necessary, or invisible. Dr. Cress Welsing, another important thing that she finally argues about that I noted down was she finally argues that the historical reliance on violence produced a cultural condition in which aggression is normalized and externalized, because she points out the ways that white Americans have institutionalized violence through policing, military expansion, incarceration, and foreign policy, often framing these actions as law and order, or defense, or civilization, and understand that in her analysis, white violence is frequently masked by language that presents it as irrational, as immoral, or as unavoidable, while violence committed by non-white people is framed as criminal, is framed as chaotic, or pathological at the same time, right? So this asymmetry, she argues that she argued all these reveal how power determines whose violence is seen as legitimate and whose is condemned. So that's why we say that America's relationship to violence is not only behavioral, but epistemological, right? Because it shapes how violence is understood, narrated, and remembered at the same time. And a key psychological component that we also need to address is, you see, in Welsing's work, she discusses what we call genetic insecurity. Let me explain. Particularly, her claims that recessive nature of lighter skin traits generates an unconscious fear of genetic annihilation among white populations. So while this aspect of a theory has been widely debated, it broadly implicated, its broad implication is central to our thinking that white violence is driven less by hatred alone and more by fear, far more of loss of status, loss of control, loss of identity. She argued that this fear manifests socially, and obsessive control over reproduction, sexuality, borders, and social hierarchy. Now, from anti-miscegenation laws to immigrant restriction and demographic panic narratives, Dr. Cress Welsing saw these policies as nonviolent expression of an underlying violent impulse to preserve dominance at all cost. Also, another thing is that Dr. Cress Welsing also emphasizes that white America's violence is often delegated rather than overt, because she noted how systems are designed so that violence appears bureaucratic, distant, or impersonal, which are executed through institutions rather than individuals. Examples include economic exploitation, environmental harm, medical neglect, and educational deprivation, all of which produces premature death and suffering without the spectacle of physical brutality. Right? So, in the sense, she expanded the definition of violence beyond physical force to include structural and psychological harm. So, for Welsing, this made white violence more dangerous, not less, because it could be denied, normalized, and reproduced across generations without moral reckoning. And what's so much important about Welsing is that she did not frame her analysis as an indictment of individual white people morality, but as a critique of a system, which is white supremacy, that conditions so much behaviors across the world. She argues that individuals are socialized into roles that reward dominance and punish dissent, making violence outcomes predictable regardless of personal intentions. This is why, in her view, liberalism alone could not resolve racial violence because the system itself incentivizes inequality. White America's, white America's recurring cycle of racial backlash, moral panic, and punitive policy responses were, to Welsing, evidence of a society that was unable to imagine equality without perceiving it as existential threat. So you understand how all that goes, right? So brothers and sisters, please let me know what you think and feel about this video. I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.